AEW in its time has had many wrestlers come and go from the company. AEW in its time has kind of become known as the promotion that doesn't release wrestlers, but would rather let wrestlers' contracts expire, but sometimes that would also lead to situations where wrestlers were sat waiting for their contracts to expire whilst doing nothing in AEW, i.e. Malachi Black, and we also may be seeing that happen with Rey Fenix currently, but that entire notion that AEW doesn't release wrestlers is a complete lie, because in their time, AEW has released 27 wrestlers. 27 wrestlers in AEW have left their contracts early, either from being released, or fired, or leaving on their own accord, and very obviously, I'm here to discuss them all today, so like the video, and let's talk about every single AEW wrestler who left their AEW contract early, and why they ended up as AEW Castaways. Let's go. One of AEW's earliest signings and an AEW OG and original member of the women's roster in early 2019, just after AEW first formed, was none other than indie standout Smiley Kylie Rae. Smiley Kylie signed for AEW early in 2019, like I said, and would debut and have her first match in AEW at their inaugural event Double or Nothing, partaking in a four-way match with Britt Baker, Nyla Rose, and Awesome Kong, with Britt Baker picking up the victory, but Smiley Kylie had left an immediate mark on AEW fans and already had a connection with them. Following this, she was then set to face Leva Bates at AEW's next event, Fyter Fest. However, when that show took place, Kylie Rae was nowhere to be seen, and unexplainably, Ali would instead face Leva Bates, as Ali had just replaced Kylie Rae in this match. And then things got even fishier, as a couple months later at All Out, there was a women's casino battle royal, where once again, Kylie Rae was noticeably absent, and this time wasn't even advertised for the show. Fans had questions, and at the post-show media scrum, AEW owner Tony Khan was asked about Kylie Rae's absence and stated that Kylie Rae wasn't actually part of AEW anymore, as she had previously requested her release and it was granted. Oh. Okay, so yeah, AEW's first release took place just a few months into the company's history, and Kylie Rae, since leaving AEW, had returned back to the indies. She had a short TNA run, an NWA run, and is now a WWE ID talent. And there has never been any confirmed reason as to why she requested to be released from AEW and that entire ordeal as to why she left, but theories have floated around. Sadie Gibbs is a female British wrestler who made her debut in December 2017. She'd spent 2018 making her way up the ranks on the indie scene and rising up through the British scene, leading up to 2019 where she would start getting booked in Japan for Stardom. Sadie Gibbs was known for her Sasuke special, and after impressing for 2 years, it was reported in early 2019 that Sadie had been signed to the newly formed AEW, with it being confirmed with an announcement on AEW's first ever show, Double or Nothing 2019. And she made her debut for AEW at All Out in the Women's Casino Battle Royal before she was eliminated in that match by Bea Priestley. And speaking of Bea Priestley, after this match, Sadie Gibbs and Bea Priestley reportedly got into a heated backstage scuffle, which saw Gibbs reportedly swing for Bea, and the two have to be separated. Sadie and Bea had issues stemming back to a year prior, after Sadie had a public argument on social media with Bea Priestley's partner at the time, Will Ospreay. And in the Casino Battle Royal match itself, Sadie and Bea could be seen no-selling and stiffing each other. And from here, Sadie Gibbs' appearances became more occasional as she was travelling from the UK, and the women of AEW were hardly being booked as it was during the early days of AEW, and she'd make her next appearance on the 4th edition of AEW Dark, losing in a 4-way match, and she'd have another match the next week on Dark as she won a tag team match alongside Ali to get her one and only win in AEW, as this would actually end up being her final AEW match. As she'd make a few more non-speaking appearances on TV and on Dark, but after the pandemic kicked in, this meant she wasn't able to travel over to the US, and after months of inactivity, she was released from her AEW contract in August 2020, having only had 3 matches. And not too long after her release, she would announce her retirement from wrestling altogether, but she returned back to wrestling earlier this year and is better than ever, having just recently worked for Pro Wrestling Noah in Japan. Sadie Gibbs was an underrated worker, and it's a shame that it didn't work out in AEW, and I hope that AEW does maybe bring her back and active again in wrestling. When it's all said and done, the biggest thing she did in AEW was have a backstage scrap with B. Priestley, and hey, speaking of B. Priestley, in January 2019, it was reported that B. Priestley was on the verge of signing for AEW, reportedly declining the WWE. This coming after a 7-year-long career thus far, where she'd worked all over the world, mainly for BritRes Promotions and Stardom. And sure enough, it was confirmed the very next month, with her debut match for AEW taking place at Fight for the Fallen in June of that year, as she teamed up with Shoko Nakajima to take on the team of Britt Baker and Riho. Herself and Shoko would pick up the win here, though during the course of the match, in fact it was B's very first moment of the match, Britt Baker got legit concussed by a stomp from B, and AEW would turn this into a feud between the two, and the two would spend much of that battle royal at All Out fighting each other, not the only fight B. Priestley was in that night, as B. Priestley and Britt Baker would take their feud until Full Gear, where Britt Baker got the win. B. Priestley had one more match on Dynamite after this, but following that her appearances became much more occasional. In fact, her next Dynamite appearance wouldn't be until March of 2020, and in that 4-month Dynamite absence, she only appeared once for AEW on Dark, and this was because B worked for Stardom and was flying over from Japan. But when she did return to Dynamite in March 2020, she teamed with Women's Champion Nyla Rose to defeat Chris Statlander and Hikaru Shida, and following the match she attacked Nyla Rose and held up the women's title, implying she'd be one of the next challengers for the belt. However, this match would never come to be, as this tag match ended up being B. Priestley's final ever AEW match, as of course the pandemic meant that she couldn't travel anymore, and she was released from AEW alongside Sadie Gibbs in August of 2020, and B. Priestley now works in WWE under the name of Blair Davenport, where her runs on NXT UK and NXT earned her a spot in the main roster, and she's now on SmackDown. Born in Dartford, Kent in 1984, Jimmy Havoc began his wrestling career in 2004 as he trained at NWA UK Hammerlock, a wrestling school he attended alongside names like Zack Sabre Jr. and Finn Balor. He made his debut that same year and would wrestle exclusively for NWA UK, and the first couple of years of his career started out slow, but in 2006 he would wrestle a match that would change the course of his wrestling career, as in 2006 he made his first appearances for other promotions outside of NWA UK, wrestling for the promotion Triple X, where he would take part in his first ever death match. A death match, if you don't know, is a wrestling match where it's more than just your average hardcore match. It's a match where the two guys in it are quite literally looking like they're trying to kill each other. Hence the name Deathmatch, and it includes much crazier spots and moments and much more graphic violence than your run-of-the-mill Extreme Rules match. And Jimmy Havoc would become very prevalent in the deathmatch wrestling scene very quickly, and soon was traveling to other countries to wrestle in death matches. He'd wrestle for Westside Extreme Wrestling in Germany, a hardcore promotion there. He'd take part in CZW's European Tournament of Death as well in the coming years. CZW, aka Combat Zone Wrestling, if you weren't aware, were the premier hardcore / deathmatch promotion in the 2000s in the US, and every year they held the Tournament of Death, which was easily the biggest deathmatch tournament in wrestling, to the point they made a European version of the tournament which Jimmy would compete in numerous times throughout the 2010s. And it wouldn't be too long until Jimmy Havoc was wrestling for CZW in America and winning the Tournament of Death there, which he did so in 2017. All the while throughout the 2010s, Jimmy Havoc would go on to become one of the biggest names in the BritRes scene, as he made his debuts for Progress and Insane Championship Wrestling in 2012, which were two of the biggest promotions in the country for the time, and he'd of course win numerous titles across numerous promotions, including also for What Culture Pro Wrestling, who he debuted for in 2016, which was the same year he debuted for TNA and had a short run with them. And basically what I'm saying is, by the time 2019 and AEW's formation came around, Jimmy Havoc had had an accomplished independent wrestling career, and was coming into AEW with a reputation as being a deathmatch guy. And fans were interested to see how a deathmatch guy like Jimmy Havoc would do in a brand new major company. He made his AEW debut at Double or Nothing 2019, their first ever show, as he was in the Casino Battle Royale, where he made it to the Final Four before being eliminated in what was a decent first showing on a major pay-per-view. He next wrestled in a 4-way match against Adam Page, Jungle Boy and MJF, won by Adam Page at Fyter Fest, the story being that all these guys were in the Battle Royal and had also confronted each other at Double or Nothing later on in that show. And then at Fight for the Fallen, he teamed with Darby Allin and Joey Janela in a loss to Shawn Spears, MJF and Sammy Guevara, losing the match as himself, Darby Allin and Janela just couldn't coexist, and this would lead to a match between the three at All Out, a 3-way Cracker Barrel brawl which saw Jimmy Havoc pick up his first win in AEW, and what felt like a big one. And the match itself was good too, with the stipulation of the match suiting all three guys' styles. His next appearance for AEW wouldn't come until a couple months later, until AEW Dynamite had officially begun on the air, as he wrestled on Dynamite episode 2 in October 2019 in a world title #1 contenders match against Darby Allin, where he was defeated by Darby. And then after this, Jimmy Havoc would mostly become a fixture of AEW Dark, as it seems as though his deathmatch style had meant his usage on AEW Weekly TV was limited. It may have also been a punishment for an incident he got into that saw him get into a fight with Excalibur right in front of Tony Khan during Tony Schiavone's birthday party. Yes, I know that sounds fake, but this actually happened, with Excalibur reportedly coming out the victor, choking out Jimmy Havoc in front of party goers. And whilst he was active in picking up wins farming Dark, his next Dynamite appearance wasn't until March 2020, when he appeared to be defeated by Cody Rhodes. He'd then have another match 4 weeks later on Dynamite in a loss to Orange Cassidy, as he started a feud with the Best Friends alongside a new teammate he had aligned himself with, fellow Brit Kip Sabian, as these two would dub themselves the Superbad Squad, joined by Penelope Ford as well. They were defeated by Best Friends in their first match as a team, but would start picking up wins on Dark and would earn themselves a #1 contendership match, which they would have in May of 2020 facing SCU, and they would pick up the win here, as the Superbad Squad were now the #1 contenders for the AEW World Tag Team titles, and they would challenge champions Kenny Omega and Adam Page the next week for the titles, but no surprises, they would fall short. Their next match as a team on Dynamite was 2 weeks later, when they would face yet another top team in AEW, as they were also defeated by the Young Bucks. Despite the losses though, it looked as though the Superbad Squad were there to stay and a new team for AEW. However, this match with the Young Bucks would actually end up being the team's last ever match, and this was because, in fact, it ended up being Jimmy Havoc's last ever match. As in June 2020 and the coming months afterwards, many pro wrestlers were accused of abuse and misconduct in a movement known as the Speaking Out movement. This movement saw many prominent wrestlers be exposed and accused of abuse and misconduct across many top promotions and independent wrestling. One of the wrestlers who was named in the Speaking Out movement was Jimmy Havoc, as Jimmy Havoc was accused by a former partner of emotional abuse. She alleged that in the 3 years they were together, she experienced him scream at her, threaten self-harm in front of her, and verbally abuse her. She also shared an account from another woman who claimed to be actually assaulted by Jimmy Havoc whilst they were together. After these allegations came out, people obviously demanded a response from AEW and Jimmy Havoc, as these were very serious allegations. And a couple of days later, we would get a response from AEW, as they would respond with a Notes app screenshot that read, "We wish Jimmy Havoc all the best as he receives treatment and counseling in an effort to overcome the mental health and substance abuse challenges in his life. We are aware of various reports related to Jimmy. We are evaluating his status with our company and will address it when he has successfully completed his rehabilitation." AEW in this tweet only referenced the allegations in one sentence, but it's obvious that this was a response and clearly done in response to the allegations. And after this, it was radio silence for a bit from AEW and Jimmy Havoc, as Jimmy Havoc was never seen on AEW AEW TV again or programming at all, as he was presumably, as AEW said, continuing on with his counseling while they evaluated his status with the company. It was radio silence all the way up until August 14th, 2020, when he was released by AEW. And since being released by AEW, it has once again been nothing but radio silence from Jimmy Havoc. Jimmy Havoc to this day has never responded to the allegations made against him or released any statement of any kind or even said a word about anything. We haven't heard a word from Jimmy Havoc. And Jimmy Havoc has never been seen again in any other wrestling company, with him never coming back to wrestling and never being seen in the ring since. And since it has been nearly 5 years since we've seen or heard from Jimmy Havoc at this point, I doubt we ever see or hear from him ever again in professional wrestling. Jimmy Havoc's AEW run lasted just over a year, and in the end a whole lot of nothing kinda happened in it, as it seemed as though his deathmatch style just didn't translate into an American weekly TV wrestling show, and based on the allegations, Jimmy Havoc was just as sadistic outside the ring. Melanie Cruz made her AEW debut on the December 4th, 2019 episode of Dynamite, debuting as a Planted Audience member who volunteered to join Brandy Rhodes and Awesome Kong in their stable called the Nightmare Collective and let them shave her head. And if you don't remember the Nightmare Collective by any chance, it was a stable made up of course Mel, which was now her name, it was no longer Melanie Cruz, just simply known as Mel, Brandy Rhodes, Awesome Kong and also Luther, and it's probably the biggest bust in early AEW in their first year here in 2019. And she would make her in-ring debut on the 15th of January 2020 Dynamite, teaming up with Brandy Rhodes in a loss against Chris Statlander and Hikaru Shida. It was originally meant to be Mel and Awesome Kong teaming together, but Kong got injured so Brandy Rhodes had to replace her, and the match definitely suffered as a result of that, but Mel herself was also not an impressive worker and really didn't show much in this match. It was a pretty woeful match and not a good debut match whatsoever for Mel. She'd wrestle once more that month, losing to Shida on Dark, but after this the Nightmare Collective continued to get a negative reception and was completely rejected by the fans with go away heat. And so because of this, in late January 2020, AEW would also start airing segments of Brandy Rhodes seeing a therapist, and this was done to disband the Nightmare Collective group and return Brandy Rhodes back to a regular character. And so just like that, the Nightmare Collective was finished. They lasted only a couple of months and it was scrapped due to it just being completely rejected by the fans. Mel really got her head shaved just for the group to end a month later. Now that is tough. And without the Nightmare Collective, Mel was left to tread water alone and AEW had no idea what to do with her. Mel would only wrestle occasionally and never on TV, it was always on YouTube. She'd pick up her first win against Kylan King on Dark in May, as well as enter the Women's Deadly Draw Tag Team Tournament where she was paired with Penelope Ford and lost to Ali and former ally Brandy Rhodes. This match of course was on YouTube. She'd get one last victory against Red Velvet on Dark, and after nearly a year of inactivity from AEW after this, she was removed from the roster page in August of 2021. From her AEW debut in December of 2019, she wrestled only 5 times for the company, and I cannot stress enough, shaved her head for the company just for her storyline to be scrapped a month later. Ouch. In 2016, Jake Atlas made his wrestling debut, and for the next couple of years he would make his mark on the independent scene, wrestling for the likes of Championship Wrestling from Hollywood, Beyond Wrestling, Warrior Wrestling, PWG, GCW and Ring of Honor. On October 23rd, 2019, Jake Atlas would sign with the WWE for the NXT brand. It was his big break. However, I think it's fair to say that his WWE run was very uneventful. Jake mainly wrestled in the Cruiserweight division and on 205 Live, with his biggest match being against Santos Escobar for the Cruiserweight title, which he lost. And on August 6th, 2021, after just under 2 years in the WWE, Jake Atlas was released from his contract as part of a round of budget cut releases. Following his WWE release, he'd wrestled for GCW and Ring of Honor in September 2021, but shortly after, he announced his retirement from wrestling. But nobody retires in wrestling, and 3 months later, Jake Atlas was back. He appeared on AEW Dark in December, coming out of retirement and defeating Serpentico, and then on the January 7th edition of AEW Rampage, Jake Atlas would face Adam Cole in a match. He would lose the match, but he was announced as being all elite after the show. Jake Atlas was back, and in a big way. Unfortunately for him though, he got injured in this match, suffering a knee injury that would leave him out for most of a year. And even more unfortunately was that only a few months into his injury, controversy would call. As on May 3rd, 2022, Jake Atlas was arrested after his boyfriend called the police on him. Atlas had reportedly scratched his boyfriend and tore his tank top during an argument over a sexual encounter. Jake Atlas was charged with misdemeanor domestic battery, and Jake Atlas, in a tweet that no longer exists, apologized for his actions and said that he was under the influence when it happened, and says though that does not excuse his behavior, he has been attending an alcohol abuse treatment program for the past 7 years, and he intends to continue. The charges were later dropped, but a video of the arrest was released, showing the footage from the police's POV, showing Jake Atlas pull the I'm famous card, call his boyfriend a nobody, a bitch ass, and said that he was bad at sex. It's an uncomfortable video. Jake Atlas' contract finished with AEW, who had no intention to re-sign him in October 2022, and he has not been involved in wrestling since. Shanna made her AEW debut on the October 30th, 2019 edition of AEW Dynamite, and it was later reported on that she had signed with AEW and became All Elite. Prior to AEW, Shanna had mainly worked the European wrestling scene, but also did some stuff with TNA and Stardom. She was an early star of the AEW women's division and would actually get decent TV time compared to a lot of the other women on the roster. But when the pandemic kicked in, it meant that Shanna wasn't able to travel to AEW tapings, and so she took an 8-month absence from wrestling for AEW. However, when Shanna did return, it seemed as though AEW didn't really know what to do with her, and her return wasn't really treated as a big deal whatsoever, but rather a side thought, as she would return on AEW Dark instead of TV, and Dark would be the main show that you would see Shanna appearing on. She returned in November of 2020, and her next TV appearance wasn't until 2 months later in January of 2021, losing to Britt Baker on Dynamite, and after that, it was right back to AEW Dark. And she would keep having matches on Dark up until April of 2021, when suddenly those matches and appearances just stopped, and Shanna would suddenly disappear from AEW. 2 months later in June, it was reported that Shanna was gone from AEW due to contract expiry, and had actually indeed been gone since April. And a Fightful Select report would state that AEW's decision to not renew her contract came after allegations about Shanna mistreating extras had come out. The report stated that there was issues with her and some of the other wrestlers, mainly extras, who had issues with the way she treated them. It was all pretty vague and never really followed up on, and as far as I'm aware, Shanna never responded to these reports either, and everyone kinda just moved on as AEW continued on, and Shanna is back on the indies. Shanna's AEW run was very uneventful, even though it started out decent, and she was mainly relegated to Dark, which is where she'd have to work with a lot of extras, and obviously we all know now what allegedly happened there. On November 30th, 2021, Big Swole announced that her and AEW had mutually parted ways after she had spent 2 years with the company. Big Swole's statement got a good response, and it seemed like Big Swole had left AEW on good terms. But then on New Year's Eve of that year, everything kicked off. Big Swole hosted a call-in podcast where she talks about some of the issues she had with AEW and their lack of diversity, saying the following: "I do not beat around the bush when it comes to diversity in my people. There is no representation, truly, and when there is, does not come across in the black community as genuine at all. And I don't know why everybody is so afraid to accept it or say it, but it's not a good look. What happens is you have this wonderful company that treats people like family, but there is nobody that looks like me that is represented at the top. They are not in the room with them. They're not helping to necessarily influence decisions, but to explain why certain slang, why they are certain words that shouldn't be said. There is no one else who can explain our culture and experience except for us. I believe that AEW is making better strides than before, but a couple of things need to be fixed. You have to be able to call people out because not everything is not perfect. I hope they listen to this with an open heart and not just, she's just saying this because of XYZ. I genuinely want them to succeed. I love art, I love to be creative, and I love wrestling, and I want it to succeed, and I want the people in it to succeed if they are genuine people. I want WWE to succeed. I just want wrestling to flourish, and I don't want it to be a long forgotten Tartarian sport where in the old days we used to wrestle. I want nothing but the best, but I also want the change and application to happen. With promises you made to be diverse, I want to see that. Not just with black people, I want to see a dark-skinned Latina or Latino, or just something. More Asians. I feel like Asians, Indians do not get love. They just don't. It's such a big gap. I hate the fact that I turn on the TV and it's the same stuff over and over again. Like the Truman Show. Hopefully, they get the message. And they would get the message, but Big Swole would definitely not receive the response she wanted, as Tony Khan would respond to her. The top 2 AEW execs are Brown, me and Mega, Jade, Bowens, Caster, Dante, Nyla, Isaiah and Mark Quinn all won on TV this month. The TBS title tournament has been very diverse. I let Swole's contract expire as I felt her wrestling wasn't good enough. AEW Rampage Street Fight tonight. And wow, this tweet did not go down well. This tweet caused an absolute stir on wrestling Twitter. Kazarian was an AEW original, having been part of AEW since the very inception of the company in January 2019 as one of AEW's first signings. Before AEW, Kazarian had an extensive indie career and is one of the most successful non-WWE wrestlers of the past couple of decades. He was a multi-time TNA X Division and TNA Tag Team Champion, as well as being a former Ring of Honor Tag Champ and a Ring of Honor 6-Man Tag Champ. He held those titles alongside Scorpio Sky and Christopher Daniels in a trio named SoCal Uncensored, aka SCU. And the trio had found decent success prior to AEW and they were all signed together. Kazarian made his AEW debut alongside SCU as they faced the Strong Hearts at Double or Nothing and came out victorious. He then wrestled alongside Scorpio Sky at Fyter Fest and Fight for the Fallen in a 3-way tag match and also a tag match against the Lucha Bros respectively, but came out losing both. But they would claim a big victory over the Jurassic Express at All Out, and following this, SCU would enter themselves into the AEW World Tag Team title tournament to crown the inaugural champions. Kazarian and Scorpio Sky would enter on behalf of SCU and would make it all the way to the finals where they would face the Lucha Bros once again. The match took place on the Dynamite Halloween special, and this time SCU came out on top and became the first ever AEW World Tag Team Champions. They retained them in a 3-way match at Full Gear and would remain active on TV and defending the belts, as they would get defenses against the Inner Circle and the Young Bucks under their belts before losing the titles to Kenny Omega and Adam Page at the start of 2020, ending their title reign at just 83 days. And following this, they would start feuding with the Dark Order, who were teasing the arrival of the Exalted One, which was potentially being teased to be member of SCU Christopher Daniels. However, we of course all know it ended up being Mr. Brody Lee, which was the correct choice, and after their feud with the Dark Order ended, SCU looked to be going separate ways and were starting to fizzle out on AEW TV. Daniels was teasing retirement, Scorpio had become a singles wrestler, and SCU would have their final tag title match against the Young Bucks on May 14th, 2021, where if they lost, they would have to disband the team, and both of those things would of course happen as SCU lost the match and the team was disbanded and they were no more, as Kazarian would start wrestling singles. He would take on a new gimmick titled the Elite Hunter, where he would stalk the Elite and always be the equalizer for whoever they were beating down as revenge for breaking up SCU. It was actually a really good character, and he was on TV actively involved in the top storyline in the company because of it, but it randomly just fizzled out with no explanation, and Kazarian just became a generic babyface, and his TV time would become a lot more sporadic. He'd have his final big program in May of 2022 after 6 months off TV, as he faced former ally Scorpio Sky, who was now a heel, for his TNT title in a losing effort, and this led to the most random AEW pay-per-view match of all time, as at Double or Nothing, he would team up with Sammy Guevara and Ty Conti in a losing effort to Scorpio, Ethan Page, and Paige Van Zant. And after this, he was relegated back to Dark, with only one more TV appearance in a Battle Royal after this, as at the end of 2022, start of 2023, Kazarian Kazarian would depart AEW officially to join Impact Wrestling, who he had actually been wrestling for on the side since 2021. And on his AEW departure, Kaz stated, "It just became apparent to me that what I like and what I appreciate about pro wrestling and the way I like it presented was just not happening at AEW. That's not an indictment of them, it's just what they perceive as good television wrestling, and what I do are different things." On the December 22nd, 2022 episode of AEW Dynamite, the Mogul affiliate stable would make their debut in AEW by attacking Keith Lee. Being led by Swerve Strickland, this new stable consisted of himself, Rick Ross, Parker Boudreaux, and another tattooed guy, who nobody was able to immediately identify, which meant this was a new AEW signing, as the others in the stable were all people that had appeared in AEW previously or were known to be signed. Swerve Strickland had been signed to AEW since the start of that year. Parker Boudreaux, though also a random signing, had been signed for some time and was part of another random stable before in the Trustbusters. Heck, even Rick Ross had appeared in AEW before the forming of the Mogul affiliates. However, this tatted guy clearly was someone who was new and hadn't appeared in AEW before. And once again, nobody knew who this was at first. People suspected he was an indie wrestling talent, but still, nobody was able to dig up any old matches or anything to find out who this was, but it was eventually revealed that this guy was known as Trench. Real name Grandin Goatsman, he's a former baseball player who was 30 at the time of signing with AEW and had zero prior wrestling experience. Regardless though, you can definitely say that Trench had a great look and looks like he belonged in the Mogul affiliate, but it was gonna be interesting to see how he would do and how he was as a wrestler, considering he had no experience and was being thrown into a major company. He would continue to appear on TV along with the Mogul affiliates as Swerve would continue feuding with Keith Lee in their never-ending feud, but as the months went on, Trench still hadn't wrestled a match or to my knowledge even spoke all that much, and the Mogul affiliates would become more and more of an afterthought as the months went by. Then in March 2022, both Trench and Parker Boudreaux would go down with injuries, and in their absence the Mogul affiliates would pretty much dissolve and come to an end when Swerve formed the Mogul Embassy with the Gates of Agony and Brian Cage as his new stablemates. And then in June of 2023 it was reported that AEW had no further plans for Trench and Parker, and sure enough, on July 3rd it was reported that Trench was no longer under contract with AEW, having had 0 matches and being a complete afterthought from the moment he debuted. I bet most of you watching don't even remember him. A completely pointless signing. I am putting all of these guys into one entry because both these incidents have been talked about to death, and that's exactly why I put this at the end of the video. The infamous All Out 2022 Brawl, aka Brawl Out, took place after months of tension between CM Punk and the Elite. Hangman had got on the bad side of Punk after he went off script in a promo with Punk and mentioned the rumor of Colt Cabana being taken off TV because of CM Punk, something that is denied by Punk. This would lead to Punk going off script himself when he randomly called out Hangman despite not feuding with him to try and bury him, and then of course the infamous All Out press scrum where CM Punk would verbally eviscerate Adam Page and the rest of the Elite, leading to Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks going to his locker room to talk to Punk. And as always, there are so many different versions of this story, but one thing led to another and a brawl broke out. There was chairs flying, punches were thrown, bites were being bitten, and everyone involved in this brawl was suspended indefinitely. That includes Kenny Omega, Matt Jackson, Nick Jackson, CM Punk, Michael Nakazawa, Brandon Cutler, Pat Buck, Christopher Daniels. They were all suspended, and Ace Steel was fired. The Elite would be the first to return, as they would come back a few months later and win the Trios belts, and Punk wouldn't return until nearly a year later when AEW Collision was created in July 2023. But Punk's AEW comeback was short-lived, as CM Punk would get into another scuffle, this time with Jack Perry at All In. On the pre-show, Jack Perry fired a shot at Punk on camera shouting "Real Glass, go cry me a river," a reference to CM Punk supposedly talking him out of doing a spot with Real Glass just weeks prior. Punk took offense to this and the two got into it backstage, with Punk getting Perry into a headlock and responsibly choking him, as he said, before being separated, and Punk getting in Tony Khan's face and shouting that he quits. Punk's contract would be terminated after Tony Khan said he feared for his life, and we actually know every detail of what happened in this scuffle because AEW questionably chose to air this footage of the encounter, which didn't make them look good at all, and CM Punk has of course since left AEW after his contract was terminated and returned to the WWE, and he has not looked back since. In March of 2019, it was announced that former TNA and indie wrestling star Ali was signed to AEW. Ali was most well known for being a two-time TNA Knockouts champion and also for being killed off in TNA canon, like they legit did an angle where she got murdered. She debuted at Fyter Fest as a white meat babyface, defeating Leva Bates, and then was defeated by Brandy Rhodes at Fight for the Fallen in an absolutely awful match. Ali would wrestle on Dark and not have a TV match the entirety of 2019, but in November of 2019 she'd get a much needed gimmick change as she debuted the Bunny alongside the Butcher and the Blade. And Ali for the next 6 months worked exclusively as a manager and not wrestling at all, but she was getting decent TV time alongside the team. However, in May of 2020, the Bunny would split off from the Butcher and Blade, turn babyface, return to a regular look, call herself Ali again, and start an on-screen relationship with QT Marshall for literally no reason and no explanation whatsoever or no build. And she would finally make her wrestling return in June as she formed the Nightmare Sisters tag team alongside Brandy Rhodes. They went on a win streak and even picked up a win on Dynamite in Ali's TV debut match that finally got to happen, but this team fizzled out quick, probably because it wasn't good, and in October, her relationship with QT would end on screen and she would return back to being a heel and now back as the Bunny alongside the Butcher and Blade, which was the right choice, but she was now pretty much a jobber. And though her TV time was a little more frequent now, she wasn't doing anything meaningful on TV, and for the rest of 2021, she spent it jobbing, other than her feud with Ty Conti and Anna Jay, aka Ty J. This was probably the best thing Ali did in her AEW career, as herself and Penelope Ford, who she'd been aligned with for a couple of months, took on Ty J in a street fight, and this match was awesome. It was bloody, it was hardcore, and like I said, easily the best thing that Ali did in AEW. However, as you guessed, she lost this match and was straight back to being a jobber, as AEW still didn't seem intent on doing much with Ali. 2022 was a very quiet year for her. She did get a title match against Jade Cargill to start the year off, which she of course lost, as Ali was hardly seen on TV this year and went 7 months without wrestling at all at one point this year. She'd stick around until 2023 and even got a title match versus Jamie Hayter in February, but got injured in that match and she would be out for 6 months once again, and when she returned 6 months later, she would only wrestle another 2 matches before she was quietly released from AEW, as herself and AEW had mutually agreed to the departure. No reason has been given for why she left, and she hasn't spoken on it, so your guess for why she left is just as good as mine, as we still don't know why. Santana debuted for AEW alongside Ortiz at AEW All Out 2019, attacking the Young Bucks to a huge ovation, as fans were excited to see Ortiz and Santana in AEW, as they were just fresh off an amazing run in Impact Wrestling. And Ortiz and Santana went off to a hot start in AEW as they joined Chris Jericho's Inner Circle on the first Dynamite episode, and their first feud in the company was with the Young Bucks, who they would beat at Full Gear in a huge win for them. However, the Young Bucks would win the feud by beating them in a Dynamite match, and Ortiz and Santana didn't have too much of an impact for their first couple of months in AEW, and came into 2020 with a chip on their shoulder as they hadn't been a top player in the tag division like initially thought. However, they were actually next in line for the tag titles and were scheduled to beat SCU for the tag titles at the start of the year. That was the plan. However, those plans had to get pushed back after Santana's father unfortunately passed away, and Santana would be off TV for a tiny bit, and the titles were shifted to Kenny Omega and Adam Page instead. Ortiz and Santana would continue on in the tag division, but were not being used as a tag team in any meaningful way, and were mostly seen wrestling alongside the Inner Circle. They were part of the Stadium Stampede match in 2020, which was cool, but by this point, Ortiz and Santana were nothing but just members of the Inner Circle and hardly felt like a force in the tag division anymore. And it would continue this way for a while. Whatever they were doing just revolved around whatever the Inner Circle were doing, whether it be the feud with the Pinnacle or that god-awful feud with American Top Team, which took up way too much time in 2021, which I'm never gonna get back. And it wouldn't be until March of 2022 that the Inner Circle were finally disbanded, and this should have meant good things for Ortiz and Santana, but it seemingly got a lot worse for them. Santana and Ortiz would start feuding with the Jericho Appreciation Society, and himself and Ortiz wouldn't even get to return to the tag division, as now they were feuding with the JAS like I said, and also aligned with the Blackpool Combat Club, which is not a bad spot to be in, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't the spot they needed to be in. Santana was a part of the losing team for Anarchy at the Arena at Double or Nothing, but was in the winning team in the Blood and Guts match. Unfortunately though, Santana got injured in this match and would be out for over a year. And during this absence, himself and Ortiz would fall out behind the scenes, and when he was to return, his team with Ortiz probably wasn't going to last much longer in AEW, which was just unfortunate given they never really made a mark as a tag team in AEW. He would return after a year-long absence in August of 2023 to be a part of the Stadium Stampede match alongside Blackpool Combat Club and Ortiz at All In, where they were defeated by Eddie Kingston, Best Friends and Penta. And following this match, himself and Ortiz would officially disband in AEW, and they would have a no DQ match on Rampage, which Santana won. But really lads, Rampage? Like, come on, surely you could have put this match on Dynamite or even a pay-per-view pre-show. These guys deserved better. And that match against Ortiz would actually end up being Santana's last AEW match. He wasn't seen or heard from on TV after this, as there was seemingly no plans for him, and in March 2024, after 5 months of inactivity, he departed AEW on his own accord. He states he wanted to leave the company as far back as his injury in 2022, as well as saying he felt pissed off not winning the tag titles and not wanting to be just another guy on the roster as to why he left AEW. Stu Grayson is an odd one because Stu Grayson is someone I've discussed on this channel before recently, as he came into AEW on the first ever show, Double or Nothing 2019, debuting alongside Evil Uno as the Dark Order, and obviously that stable would grow and have regular TV time for the first couple of years. They had Brody Lee in the group, they recruited Anna Jay and Preston Vance and Alan Angels and Colt Cabana, they were teamed up with Hangman Page, but after Page won the world title, their TV time got more occasional, and Stu Grayson would depart the company in 2022 before returning to AEW in 2023, I believe the first wrestler to leave the company and come back, and he'd return briefly as a member of the Dark Order, but would then leave the group to join the Righteous in Ring of Honor. But then out of nowhere, after losing to the Dark Order in July of 2023, Stu Grayson has not been seen in AEW or Ring of Honor programming or alongside the Righteous whatsoever. And now obviously he has been released, meaning he's the first AEW wrestler to exit the company twice. He's the first to get released and have his contract expire, I guess. I don't really know what to say. But I guess if they weren't using him, then this is the best case, and he can go work the indies and do some good stuff alongside Evil Uno on DPW and other promotions. Jose the Assistant, I don't really know what much else to say about Jose the Assistant other than that he was Andrade's manager in the company. That's kind of what he was known for and what he did in AEW, and obviously this past December Andrade departed AEW and is now back in the WWE. I don't think Jose the Assistant has done anything since that happened, so there's probably not much else use for him. I'm guessing that's why he's been released here, and I don't really know what else to say. We have Dasha Gonzalez, who is an ex-WWE wrestler and also an ex-WWE announcer, and when she came to AEW, she started off announcing for the Spanish broadcast and even tried one match in AEW. She was part of that weird tag team tournament, and she was definitely a lot better as a ring announcer than she was as a wrestler, and I think she was pretty good at what she did. She did ring announcing, but mainly backstage interviewing, and I thought again that she was pretty good, so I'm actually quite surprised to see her be released here. But AEW has a surplus of ring announcers and backstage interviewers, and they already have Renee Paquette, so I'm guessing that she's just been lost in the shuffle of all the ring announcers, and that's what's happened here. The Boys, aka the Tate Twins, this is a really weird release due to the fact that they were right in the middle of a Ring of Honor storyline and one of the most major Ring of Honor storylines going on right now between Johnny TV and Dalton Castle. The Boys went along with Dalton Castle and they were a package deal. The Boys always came along with Dalton Castle, and this storyline with Dalton Castle and Johnny TV saw Johnny TV beat Castle to steal the Boys from him. And it was a pretty good storyline, and like I said, the Boys were right in the middle of the storyline, but this past week on Ring of Honor, the Boys weren't present for the Dalton Castle and Johnny TV segments on the show, and it was said by Taya that they were eaten by bears or something, and now they've been released, so I guess that's the official way that they've been written off in Ring of Honor, which is crazy. Gravity, I believe, started making appearances last year for AEW, and I think he was signed for pretty much one reason, and that was just for him to face Pac. Just so they could do the man Gravity forgot memes and forgot jokes. But honestly, this is one of those guys I didn't even realize he was signed, and there's a couple of these guys on this list that, again, I didn't realize was signed, and I'm surprised he actually was released because I quite enjoyed him and thought he was a good wrestler and a good high flyer and a fun masked wrestler. I think he's kind of a perfect fit for Ring of Honor, so I don't know why they've released him. I'm not expecting to see him on AEW TV or anything, but you could at least keep him around for Ring of Honor, surely. There's Jora Joel, who again didn't realize he was even signed to the company or signed at all, because I don't remember the last time I even saw him make an appearance for AEW. I remember him from the pandemic era, and he was of course part of the Hardy family office, and I don't think he ever actually made it onto TV with the group. I think he was always left on Dark, even though he was in the group, and then obviously that group died out, and I haven't seen or heard of him in AEW since that group died out. He might have been on Dark, but I was never really a Dark viewer. Either way, once again, just didn't realize he was signed. He's not been on AEW TV or programming in a long time, but I guess now he never will again. Anthony Henry getting released is a true shame because Anthony Henry is a really good worker. If you don't know, Anthony Henry is in a tag team with JD Drake, who has been kept here, so they clearly rate JD Drake. And they're called the Workhorsemen, and they're a very underrated team. I'm going to put some footage on screen right now of their work in DPW, which is some stuff you should definitely check out. And just a guy I'm puzzled that why wouldn't they want to use him on Rampage or on Ring of Honor. This is a guy who again comes with a tag team partner, JD Drake. They're a good tag team, so why release Anthony Henry? I don't understand it. And the guy is also injured. He's injured, he's recovering from injury, and I know that injury didn't happen on AEW, but that's still a bit of a shame to release him while he's injured. Slim J. What do I even have to say on Slim J? One of the weirdest AEW signings. I'm not sure what he even did other than in 2022 and 2023 for a bit. The Trustbusters, himself, Parker Boudreaux, Sonny Kiss, and Ari Daivari, the most random faction in AEW history. I do know he has been on Ring of Honor, but I know he's also been a jobber on there and kind of been doing the same thing he was doing on Dark before. And yeah, he's just a jobber. I think he was mainly brought in for his wrestling experience, but he's clearly a guy that was never going to go anywhere in AEW, rising up the divisions and winning titles, and clearly they don't see much else use in him. But unfortunately, he wasn't the only Trustbuster that was released that day. Why on earth did AEW sign Parker Boudreaux? I will truly never understand it. If you don't know who Parker Boudreaux is, he's actually a former WWE talent who didn't last very long there. We'll talk about that in a second. But he came into WWE with a bit of hype behind him, and that's because Parker Boudreaux was a college football standout. But due to concussion problems, he had to call his career early. However, when Paul Heyman became aware of him and likened him to Brock Lesnar due to the two having a striking resemblance, as well as calling him the next big thing, hype behind Parker started to build, and fans figured that Parker Boudreaux may end up in the WWE very soon. He had the Paul Heyman endorsement, he had the exact look and build that WWE love, and WWE had also just entered an era where they were signing more athletes to the company, just like Parker Boudreaux. And sure enough, Parker Boudreaux would sign for the WWE, with reports coming out from February 6, 2021 that he had signed a contract, with AEW also in the race to sign him. And later that month, that report was confirmed, and Parker Boudreaux would report to the WWE Performance Center, and after about 6 months of training in the PC, Parker would make his first appearance on NXT TV on the October 5th, 2021 episode, as he aligned himself with Joe Gacy as his muscle. And he was now under the brand new ring name of Harland, no relation to Erling whatsoever. He was actually originally called Gunnar Harland, which I think is actually a really sicko mode name, but it was reduced to just Harland after a couple of days. He would make his in-ring debut a couple months later in December, defeating Guru Raj, just squashing him, and he continued to squash wrestlers for the next 4 months alongside Joe Gacy. However, out of nowhere, he was released from the WWE on April 29th, 2022. A release that was out of nowhere due to the sheer amount of hype around him before he had signed for the WWE, and for the fact that he had just gotten started and had hardly even done anything in the company. And apparently, the reason that WWE fired Parker Boudreaux was that WWE wanted him as a member of the Judgment Day. That was the original plan for him, but after Parker showed no improvement in the ring and apparently had developed a bit of a reputation of that he gets hurt a lot, these plans were scrapped, and WWE ultimately just chose to let him go. Following his WWE release, Parker would return to wrestling to turn up in the MLW Battle Riot in June 2022, back using his real name of Parker Boudreaux, and then soon after, he would start making appearances on AEW Dark. He would become a regular on the show, and he would form the Trustbusters alongside Arya Daivari, Slim J, and Sonny Kiss, pretty much the most random stable in wrestling history. And he was squashing guys weekly on AEW Dark for months, pretty much just the same as he was doing in NXT. Surprisingly enough though, he gets signed to a full-time contract in August and make his first TV appearance that same month, and it was a puzzling signing given that he was in a jobber stable and nearly exclusive to the Dark brand. But that was going to change seemingly, as Parker Boudreaux would appear on the December 22nd Dynamite episode, where he was revealed as a member of the Mogul affiliate alongside Swerve Strickland, Trench if you remember that guy, and Rick Ross as well. However, this just didn't last long at all, and months later Parker Boudreaux would disappear from the group as the Mogul affiliates merged with the Embassy to form the Mogul Embassy, and he wasn't a part of it. And that was all the way back in April of 2023. His last match was in March of 2023 in a tag match with Swerve Strickland, so it's been over a year since he appeared for AEW, as he was injured with an unknown serious injury in July. But finally, after sticking around in AEW for a while just doing absolutely nothing, Parker Boudreaux was released from AEW in April 2024 as part of budget cuts in AEW. On the October 23rd, 2013 episode of WWE NXT, the ravishing Russian Lana would make her WWE debut, scouting Alexander Rusev, the man she would eventually become the on-screen manager of, as CJ Perry, who played Lana, had no wrestling experience prior to signing, but quickly embraced the role she was in and was brilliant in her role, particularly with her excellent mic work. And her and Rusev were a great act together, and after a quick NXT run, they were called up to the main roster in 2014 and would quickly rise up the roster as Rusev would become US champion in November. He'd have a great reign, which of course included the match against John Cena at WrestleMania, which of course he lost, but Lana was there as well through all of this, and it was a great spot for both of them. But after Rusev lost, the rest of Lana's WWE run was kinda weird. They teased a breakup between Lana and Rusev on TV, but after it came out they had got married in real life, those plans were quickly reversed, and she would continue to accompany Rusev and even started wrestling herself and had a few matches over the years, but the less said about them the better. Then in 2019 there was that weird storyline with her and Bobby Lashley, and then that weekly period of Nia Jax putting her through tables, and after Rusev was released from WWE in 2020, Lana would stick around for a bit, but eventually she herself was released from the WWE on June 2nd, 2021. She would go inactive in wrestling for a bit, but she would return to wrestling when she made her AEW debut on the All Out pay-per-view in 2023, coming to the aid of Miro, who seemed hesitant about CJ Perry now managing him. She was under the name of CJ now in AEW, and she would later say in a Collision interview that she would not be managing Miro in AEW and looking for other clients instead, and thus would start managing Andrade, who funnily enough found himself feuding with Miro. Andrade and Miro faced at World's End, where Miro won in what was Andrade's final match for AEW, and one where CJ turned on him to realign with Miro, as it looked like she was now going to be the full-time on-screen manager for him. But after this, CJ was never seen on AEW again, as Miro went out with injury, and it was also revealed that they had divorced, so would be kinda awkward putting them on TV together. And CJ revealed in July of this year that she was no longer with AEW, and her appearances were pretty much for nothing. Ricky Starks has been in AEW for nearly 5 years now. He signed for AEW during the pandemic in 2020 and had a solid few years in AEW, being part of Team Taz, facing Sting, winning the tag titles, feuding with CM Punk and beating him, being some of his biggest moments in the company. However, throughout Ricky Starks' entire AEW run, his push hasn't been consistent, and AEW have constantly failed to capitalize on his momentum and push him to the next level when there were opportunities to do so. His last match in AEW took place on the March 30th AEW Collision, as he teamed with Big Bill and they took on Top Flight in a tournament match. A match that Ricky Starks and Big Bill were actually supposed to win, but the match had to be cut off early, with Top Flight instead taking the win after there were fears that Ricky Starks may have got concussed. And as per protocol, the finish was rushed, with Top Flight now being the winners. However though, this ended up just being a false alarm and just a concussion scare, and though they followed protocol correctly, Ricky Starks did not have a concussion and thus was cleared to compete again. But since this moment, Ricky Starks has not been seen or heard from on AEW TV since. And the reason for why Ricky Starks has never been used by AEW has never been explicitly known. However, there are obviously many theories. There were some reports that Ricky Starks had rejected plans for a return, but these were denied by Starks himself. And many speculate the reason why Ricky Starks is in AEW purgatory is because AEW expects him to leave the company to join WWE at some point, and clearly don't see him as a long-term guy. Though there are mixed reports on when his contract in AEW is up, and he's been on the shelf for a while now. Regardless of any speculation though, whenever Ricky Starks has ever been asked about why he's been kept off TV, he has always said he has no idea why, and no reason was ever given. And this all brings us to where we are now, as like I said, Ricky Starks has been on the shelf for 8 months, and on November 23rd, Ricky Starks would take matters into his own hands when he found work elsewhere himself and would appear for GCW. And in his return promo for GCW, he would address his absence from AEW, stating that he wasn't going to sit at home and let his career dwindle. And with that, more GCW matches and appearances were announced for Ricky Starks, as well as other indie appearances even being announced for GCW's upcoming Hammerstein Ballroom show, a topic that we will definitely get onto later. And then 2 days later, everything would kick off when Ricky Starks appeared on Chris Van Vliet's YouTube channel for an interview, and he had a lot to say about his AEW career. He reaffirms that he's clear and healthy and has no idea why he's been left sitting at home for as long as he has. He then discusses the time it was leaked that he visited Cody Rhodes at the Royal Rumble last year, and talks about how he was confronted by an unnamed AEW wrestler about it.
You know what's so funny about that whole situation? First off, yes, I did go see a friend of mine for his match, obviously, because it was an hour away. So I remember the next day, Sunday, I woke up and like this whole thing was blowing up, and I was just like, what is this? I had people from my job being like, I had one guy. He was just like, were you at the Rumble last night? I said, yeah, and what the fuck about it? What about it? He goes, just saying that's a bad look, you know? I said, how is it a bad look? I can't control somebody taking a security footage while I'm walking to a bus. I don't control that. Like, how is that? Tell me how that is a bad look. We got people on our own program talking about other people at the other company, but yet me having my security footage exposed is a bad look? Give me a break.
And when he was asked about his comparisons to The Rock, it would lead to Starks talking about another incident that Ricky Starks had in AEW with another AEW wrestler.
He did. You know what he called me? Do you remember?
A vanilla midget.
He called me a vanilla midget rock ripoff. You might as well call me a great heel. And I even hate saying and talking like this, but you might as well call me a great heel because I got somebody so flustered on live TV that they stumbled and stuttered their way into one of the worst insults that you could say. That's so, passe, so 2000s. A vanilla midget. I could have hit him with the, I'm black, you idiot, but I didn't at the time. You know what I'm saying? I could have did that. I didn't. Personally, out of all that, I don't think that Ricky Starks came out of that looking very bad. You know what I'm saying? I think it wasn't me that looked bad in that whole situation.
If you're unsure who Ricky Starks or what Ricky Starks is referring to here, he's talking about the time that Adam Copeland, aka Edge, went off script on him. On the October 14th, 2023 Collision, Ricky Starks made a comment to Copeland that seemingly annoyed him, leading to Copeland calling him a vanilla midget rock ripoff in a moment that was definitely not scripted and that he stumbled his words on the way to. And for the rest of the interview, he talks about CM Punk in AEW, fake news surrounding why he was gone, like the rumors of being difficult to work with and rejecting plans. And yeah, man, I'd recommend you just go ahead and watch the full interview for yourself. I'll link it down below. But it would then all kick off further yesterday, as obviously all these clips started getting posted and quoted, and more matches for Ricky Starks in GCW were being announced, until it was then reported last night that AEW had pulled Ricky Starks from his GCW appearances and he would not be appearing for the brand going forward. And many speculated that this had happened due to the comments that had gone viral about his time in AEW and the whole Chris Van Vliet interview and whatnot, and the fact that AEW's misuse of him was being used as storyline in GCW, but later on, some clarity was posted and reported on for why Ricky Starks had been pulled from GCW dates. It was said that Starks was only being blocked from his GCW dates and was still allowed to work other independent wrestling dates, and can still take bookings from other indie wrestling companies. It's just GCW that AEW were now drawing a line in the sand between, with now no AEW talent at all allowed to appear for GCW anymore. And this has nothing to do with Ricky Starks and the comments that were made by him, but rather due to the comments made by GCW wrestler Effie, who discussed how AEW were running the Hammerstein Ballroom not too long after GCW were, and made various comments about Tony Khan and his relationship with his father Shad Khan. Apparently there was exception taken to these words said, and the line has now been drawn in the sand, as I previously said, so the entire situation is just a mess, and I can't imagine it's made relations between Starks and AEW any better, as it's cost him bookings when he's still not being used for AEW as it is. Sure, he can still get indie dates elsewhere, and I'm sure he probably will, but GCW are one of the premier indies to work for, and especially given he had just started there and started a storyline there, I can't imagine he's very pleased that he's been suddenly yoinked off of them. However, I'm sure Ricky Starks is pleased as of now, as finally, after all the back and forth, Ricky Starks was finally released by AEW in February 2025. He hadn't been used in forever, everyone knew he was going to leave and go to WWE, it was about time, and before we knew it, like I said, he was rocking up in WWE, where he is now signed to under the name of Ricky Saints. Rusev was released from the WWE on April 15th, 2020 as part of budget cuts, and Rusev had been in the WWE system since 2010, and his run in the WWE overall was quite good. Especially the first few years from his main roster call-up were great, but towards the end of it, he was definitely being misused, as WWE had failed to capitalize on him multiple times, and Rusev was unhappy in the company, having requested his own release multiple times, with WWE rejecting it before finally he was released in the budget cuts. And from the moment he was released from WWE, everyone knew exactly what was gonna happen next, and of course, on the September 9th episode of AEW Dynamite, the former Rusev, now known as Miro, would make his AEW debut. Upon his debut, he aligned himself with Kip Sabian and Penelope Ford as their best man for their wedding, and the start of Miro's run in AEW was actually just kinda weird. He essentially pretty much had the gimmick of a gamer, and he was always playing an arcade machine at ringside. And a feud would kick off with the Best Friends stable in October after they accidentally broke the arcade cabinet, and this feud would, over an arcade machine, go on for months and months. I kid you not, this feud lasted about 6 months, and it was all over an arcade machine. Miro would make his pay-per-view debut for AEW at Revolution 2021 in March, as himself and Kip Sabian defeated Orange Cassidy and Chuck Taylor, but on the March 31st episode of Dynamite weeks later, they would rematch in an Anarchy arcade tag match, which was essentially just like a 2v2 street fight, but with arcade machines scattered all around the ringside area. It sounds wacky, and it definitely was, but it was a great match, and though Best Friends got the win to end the feud on top, it was definitely Miro's best match in AEW thus far, and it was good that this feud had finally ended, and it was time for Miro to do something else finally. As shortly after this, Miro would turn on Kip Sabian after attacking him, and Miro would become a lot more aggressive, dominant, and reawakened as a competitor. Miro soon after in May would challenge Darby Allin for his TNT title, and Miro would come out on top to win his first and only title in AEW. And Miro's TNT title reign was generational, legit one of my favorite TNT title reigns and one of my favorite ever title reigns in AEW. Miro during this run would start referring to himself as God's favorite champion, thanking his God for his dominance in matches, and sporting a beautiful custom TNT title belt. Miro defended on TV against the likes of Dante Martin, Evil Uno, Brian Pillman Jr., Fuego del Sol, and others, and also defended it on pay-per-view against Lance Archer and Eddie Kingston at Double or Nothing and All Out respectively. Miro would hold the title up until the 29th of September AEW Dynamite, when he lost it to Sammy Guevara, which in my opinion was a bad decision. Miro lost it way too early into his run, and the TNT title did pretty much go to shit after this, so yeah, not a great decision. After this, Miro would go off TV for a little bit of time, but would return to enter the Full Gear World Title Eliminator Tournament in November, as he filled in for Jon Moxley. He defeated Orange Cassidy in the semi-finals, but in the finals was defeated by Bryan Danielson. And then after this, Miro would take even more time away to deal with a hamstring injury and other projects away from wrestling. He'd return in June of 2022, just in time to qualify for a 4-way match at Forbidden Door to crown the first ever All-Atlantic champion. This match was of course won by Pac, and after this, Miro's appearances with AEW would be more sparse again, as he essentially disappeared again until the build-up to All Out, when he was randomly booked in a 6-man tag alongside Darby and Sting, as they defeated the House of Black at All Out in a very random match like I said. And then after this, Miro would disappear off TV again, and this time for even longer than before, and not because of any injury. Miro would go absent for months again unexplained after All Out, and it was reported that the reason for this was that AEW didn't have any creative plans for him, and then later it was reported that Miro had actually turned down creative plans for a return. The plan involved Miro returning in a battle royal where he would finish runner-up, losing to Adam Page, but he turned it down, which which definitely didn't speed up his return. Miro's return wouldn't take place all the way until the May 10th, 2023 Dynamite, an over 8-month absence. And a week later, AEW would announce their new weekly show Collision, and with that came a loose roster split being enforced, with certain guys and girls being exclusive to Collision, including Miro. Basically, AEW just put all the backstage troublemakers on Collision at the start of it. Miro would get going on Collision and start picking up steam, but quickly once again, it seemed like AEW had no plans for him, as at first he was just squashing people, and then his wrestling appearances became more occasional once again. He would start a feud with Powerhouse Hobbs in the lead up to All In/All Out, which felt like his first proper program in ages, and they had a match at All Out, which ended up being an awesome match and potentially the match of the night, as the crowd was super hot for the slapping of meat. He'd continue on through the end of the year and would start feuding with Andrade, who had Miro's wife at the time, CJ Perry, by his side, aka the former Lana from WWE, and the two had a match set for the World's End pay-per-view at the end of the year, which was set to be Andrade's final AEW match. And Miro would pick up the victory in this match with help from CJ Perry, but right after this, can you guess what happened? Well, of course, Miro disappeared from AEW TV once again, and we haven't seen him since. Miro took to social media to say he had been working injured since September, and after this, he was then taken off TV, which is puzzling because why was he working with an injury for that long? And Miro did clarify that this was a shoulder injury that he was recovering from. It was also said in April that Miro was behind schedule in recovery, but it was reported recently in August that Miro had returned to the United States, so a return could potentially be on the way soon. But man, what a flat run it has been for Miro in AEW ever since he lost that TNT title belt. It feels like he lost it, and AEW had no plans what to do with him after, and when they finally came up with something, Miro said, "That's not gonna work for me, brother." His reign as TNT champion was genuinely one of the best things in AEW ever, I really do believe that. But since losing the TNT title, Miro has only had 13 matches in AEW since then. In fact, in his entire AEW run of 4 years, he's only had 36 matches, and most of Miro's time in AEW has been spent off TV. And finally, after more than a year of inactivity and a denied release request in September 2024, Miro was finally released from AEW in February of 2025. And the final release in AEW to talk about, the most recent one, which I don't really want to talk about, but I guess I have to, is Bear Boulder, who is a former member of the Bear Country stable who turned into Iron Savages. And he was fired from AEW this past month when it was found out by AEW that he had been arrested on January 13th, 2025 for a domestic incident with his partner, which the details of it are just absolutely awful, and Bear Boulder was rightfully fired by AEW. And yeah, I just don't really want to say any more about this guy, to be honest. Good riddance from AEW. That's it for me in this video. Be sure to like the video if you did enjoy it, and comment down below what videos you would like to see next. I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye, and keep on rolling.